Go find a nursing home, my son whispered through the glass, his eyes cold as he turned the deadbolt on the house I built with my own hands. He left me to die on my back porch in a 10-degree blizzard, wearing nothing but cotton pajamas and one slipper. He thought the nor'easter would stop my heart before morning, so he could sell my land to a developer. But he forgot that I spent 40 years framing houses in winters that would snap a soft man in half. He thought he was discarding a relic. He was about to learn that you don't declare war on the architect of your own existence. If you're listening to this, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you're watching from. It helps to know I'm not just shouting into the wind. Let me tell you how a simple cup of coffee turned into the coldest night of my life. The wind didn't just groan against the house that night. It screamed with a prehistoric hunger. It was a nor'easter, the kind that reminded a man that nature held a permanent lease on the land, and humans were merely temporary tenants. I sat in my kitchen, the air smelling faintly of floor wax and the ghosts of 30 years of Sunday roasts, listening to the gale batter the north face of the structure. I had framed those walls myself in the summer of '95. I remembered the exact weight of the hammer in my hand, the way the sweat had turned the sawdust into a second skin. I had doubled the studs on that particular wall, knowing the way the wind tunneled through the valley. I had used 6-inch galvanized nails where the building code, a document I always considered a minimum for the lazy, only asked for 4. I had tucked the fiberglass insulation into the corners with the tenderness of a father tucking in a child, ensuring no pocket of cold could ever find purchase. I was Frank Miller. I understood the language of wood and stone. I understood that a structure is only as honest as its foundation, and if you lie to the foundation, the roof will eventually tell the truth. But sitting at my heavy oak kitchen table that Tuesday night, looking at the man across from me, I felt a hairline crack forming in my own center of gravity. I realized, with a clarity that felt like a punch to the solar plexus, that while I had built a house that could withstand a hurricane, I had built a family out of balsa wood and spit. My son, Scott, sat across from me. He was 35 years old, a man in the prime of his life, but as the shadows of the storm danced across his face, he looked like a stranger wearing a mask of my son's features. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than the first 3 trucks I'd ever owned combined. His shirt was a crisp, offensive blue, the color of a clear sky on a day when you're stuck inside doing paperwork. It had never seen a speck of sawdust, never been darkened by the honest salt of sweat. He was tapping a gold-plated fountain pen against the table. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a rhythm of thought. It was a rhythm of entitlement. It was the sound of a man who believed the world owed him a steady beat. To me it sounded like a saw hitting a hidden nail, a jarring, screeching discordance that set my teeth on edge. "It's a simple cash flow issue, Dad," Scott said, his voice dripping with a practiced corporate smoothness. It was the voice of a man selling a lightly used vehicle with a cracked engine block. He wasn't talking to his father. He was pitching to a skeptic. "The construction management firm is at a critical juncture," he continued, flashing a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Expansion is the only path forward. Stagnation is death in this market. I just need a bit of liquidity to bridge the gap until the Q1 payouts." Liquidity. I turned the word over in my mind. It was a coward's word for someone else's money. Last month the word had been equity. The month before that, it was leverage. He used these words as shields, hoping their complexity would distract me from the simple, ugly truth underneath. I looked down at the ledger open on the table between us. It wasn't a digital spreadsheet or a cloud-based file. It was a black, cloth-bound notebook, my personal checkbook, and record of 40 years of physical labor. Every entry was a story. This page represented the winter I spent roofing in 10-degree weather to pay for his braces. That page was the summer I took a double shift on a bridge project so he could have the right car for college. It was a record of my life's blood, dried into ink. Beside him sat his wife, Lisa. She didn't bother with the pretense of the pitch. She was hunched over her phone, her face washed in the sickly, cold blue glow of the screen. She looked bored, as if being here, in this quaint house, asking for my life savings was a tedious chore like waiting for a slow elevator or sitting through a red light. She shifted in her chair, the expensive leather of her jacket creaking, and let out a long theatrical sigh before checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "Scott," I said, and my voice sounded like gravel being ground in a mixer. I hadn't realized how dry my throat had become. "I gave you $40,000 last April. You told me then that it was the final bridge you needed." Scott stopped tapping. He blinked, a slow, calculated movement meant to project patience. But I saw the flash of irritation in his eyes, the look of a man who hated being reminded of his own debts. That was an investment in the partnership, Dad. This is different. This is about operations. You always said you wanted me to succeed. You always said a miller doesn't quit when the job gets tough. I said I wanted you to work. I corrected him, leaning forward until the light from the overhead lamp highlighted the deep, permanent creases in my calloused hands. There's a difference between a job getting tough and a job being mismanaged. You said the 40,000 was for a buy-in. You said the repayment schedule started the 1st of January. I pointed a finger at the calendar on the wall. I had circled the 1st in red. It was a habit from the job site. Deadlines were sacred. The red circle looked like a bleeding wound on the wall. It is now the middle of February, Scott. Not a dime has moved. Scott waved his hand through the air, dismissing the date as if it were a bothersome fly. He let out a condescending chuckle that made the hair on my arms stand up. Dates are fluid in the corporate world, Dad. It's not like framing a house. You're thinking in terms of inches and feet. Modern business is about momentum and optics. You can't just measure twice and cut once when you're dealing with multi-million-dollar contracts. You wouldn't understand the complexity. I understand a promise, I said, my voice dropping an octave. And I understand math. The math says you're underwater. You're asking for 20,000 more tonight. You're asking me to gut my retirement fund to bridge a gap that seems to be getting wider, not narrower. I looked deep into his eyes, searching for a glimmer of the boy I'd taught to fish, the boy who used to hold the flashlight for me while I fixed the water heater. But he wasn't there. In his place was the desperate, hollow look of a gambler who had lost the rent money and was trying to convince himself and me that the next hand was the big win. I had seen that look on job sites before. It usually belonged to the contractors who underbid by half, and were trying to hustle their way out of a lawsuit. I went by your office today, Scott, I said softly. The silence that followed was more violent than the wind outside. The tapping stopped instantly. The gold pen sat motionless on the oak. Even Lisa's thumb froze on her screen, though she didn't look up. The house seemed to hold its breath, the timber no longer groaning but waiting. The silence in the kitchen was no longer the silence of a home. It was the pressurized stillness of a diving bell sinking too deep. Lisa's thumb remained paralyzed over her phone, the blue light casting sharp, skeletal shadows across her cheekbones. Scott's face, usually so meticulously composed, began to disintegrate. The patchy, ugly red of a mounting fever crept up his neck, clashing with the expensive blue of his collar. "You what?" he asked. His voice didn't have that corporate resonance anymore. It was thin, brittle like dry kindling right before it snaps. "I went by," I repeated, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I thought maybe I'd surprised you. Bring you a coffee. See this massive expansion you've been talking about for 6 months. I wanted to be proud of you, Scott. I wanted to see the Miller name on a door that meant something." I leaned forward, the old oak chair creaking under my weight. A familiar grounding sound. The office was quiet. Too quiet for a firm in the middle of a liquidity crisis caused by growth. The receptionist, a nice girl named Patty. She looked at me like I was a ghost. She told me you hadn't been in for 3 days. She said you were on a high-level client retreat in Aspen. Scott loosened his tie with a jerky, frantic motion, though the storm outside had kept the house at a crisp 68 degrees. He looked around the room, as if searching for a script he'd lost. "It was a retreat," he snapped, the volume of his voice jumping an octave. "You don't get it, Dad. You think business happens on a floor plan with a pencil behind your ear. It doesn't. Networking is the work. Building relationships with guys like Marcus Vance happens on the slopes, over dinner, in the lounges. I pushed deals, not wheelbarrows. I reached into the pocket of my fleece loungewear. My fingers felt heavy. I pulled out a folded piece of paper, a color printout from a social media page, and slid it across the table. It came to rest right on top of his gold pen. I saw the pictures Lisa posted. I said, "I might be a dinosaur, as you like to think, but I know how to use a computer." I saw the skiing. I saw the 5-star dinners at the Little Nell. I saw the magnums of champagne with the sparklers in them. I felt a hot, searing coal of anger ignite in my gut. That's where my retirement money went, Scott. That 40,000 wasn't a buy-in for a partnership. It was a buy-in for a lifestyle you haven't earned. It didn't go into the foundation of a company. It went into your ego. You didn't invest it. You drank it. You skied on it. You wore it. The reaction was instantaneous. Lisa didn't just look up. She exploded. She slammed her phone down on the table with enough force to crack the screen. The sound was like a gunshot in a small room. Her boredom was gone, stripped away to reveal a sharp, jagged venom. "Oh, here we go," she sneered, her voice high and piercing. "The St. Frank lecture. The Sermon on the Mount of Sawdust. You sit here on this pile of money, living in this oversized mausoleum, all by yourself, clutching your checkbook like it's the Holy Grail. Do you have any idea how hard Scott works to keep up appearances in that world? He deserves a break. He deserves to live a little. You begrudge your own son a little happiness because you spent your life being a martyr for a mortgage. I begrudge the lying," I shouted back, the force of my own voice surprising me. I stood up, the chair scraping violently against the floorboards I had sanded, until my knuckles bled decades ago. "I am not an ATM, Lisa. I am his father, and a father's job is to build a man, not subsidize a fraud." I looked Scott in the eye. He remained seated, but he seemed to shrink. The expensive suit now looked 2 sizes too big, as if the hollow space inside him was finally starting to show on the outside. "The tap is closed," I declared, my voice trembling with the weight of the finality. "No more investments. No more liquidity. In fact, I want a formal repayment schedule for that $40,000. I want the first check on this table by the 1st of next month. With interest." Scott stood up then. He was taller than me now. He had my height, but none of my hardness. He was heavy with soft weight, the kind that comes from steak dinners and sitting in climate-controlled offices. His face was no longer red. It was a sickly, translucent white. "You can't do that," he said, and the smoothness was completely gone. His voice was high, panicked, the sound of a cornered animal. "I have payments due, Dad. Real payments. I've got the lease on the Mercedes, the country club dues, the private school deposit for the fall. If I don't have that cash by Friday, I default on the truck. I look like a failure to the partners. I lose everything. Then sell the truck," I said, my heart turning to stone. "Sell the SUV. Move into a smaller place. Learn to live within the walls you can actually afford to build. That's what a man does." "You're sabotaging me," Scott screamed. A spray of spittle flew from his mouth, catching the light of the kitchen lamp. He stepped around the table, his movements wild and uncoordinated. "You want me to fail? You've always been jealous of me, haven't you?" "Jealous?" I asked, genuinely bewildered. "Of what, Scott? Your debt? Your stress? Your lies?" "Jealous that I work with my brain and not my back like some goddamn mule," he yelled, his face inches from mine. "You think you're better than everyone because you have calluses and a pension. You're a relic, Dad, a dinosaur. You're a man who spent his life building houses for people who actually matter, while you stayed stuck in the mud. A mule carries the load," I thought bitterly. "A parasite just takes it. I work with honor," I growled, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "And right now you have none. You have no frame, Scott. You're all finishing trim with no load-bearing walls. You're going to collapse, and I'm not going to be the one crushed under the debris." Scott's eyes went dark, a hollow, vacuum-like blackness I had never seen in him. It wasn't just anger, it was the total erasure of empathy. He reached out and grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by a frantic cornered adrenaline. "Don't you touch me," I warned, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that had stopped many a subcontractor in their tracks. "Get your hands off me in my own house." "Your house?" Scott spat, his face twisting into something unrecognizable. "You think you're the king of this castle? You're just a sad, lonely old man waiting for the clock to run out. You're an obstacle, Dad. That's all you are now. An obstacle to my future." Before I could process the words, he shoved me. It wasn't a push to get past me. It was a violent, two-handed strike to my chest. My felt slippers, designed for comfort on a quiet evening, found no purchase on the highly polished oak floor. I stumbled backward, my arms windmilling as I tried to catch the air. I hit the granite island in the center of the kitchen. a slab of stone I had picked out because of its permanence. The sharp, unforgiving corner dug deep into my hip. A bolt of white-hot electric pain shot down my leg, making my vision swim with gray spots. "Scott!" I gasped, my fingers clawing at the smooth granite to keep from sliding to the floor. "Scott, stop!" He didn't stop. He didn't look horrified by what he'd done. He didn't reach out to catch me. Instead, he marched forward, his chest heaving, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He reached down and grabbed the front of my fleece loungewear, bunching the thick gray fabric in his fist and dragging me toward the back of the house. The grip on my chest was a violation of every law I had ever lived by. To be handled by the man I had once cradled was a structural failure of the soul. Scott's knuckles were white, his eyes wide and vacant of anything resembling kinship. He didn't see a father. He saw a debt collector he could finally silence. "Get out," he hissed. The words were quiet, which made them more terrifying than the shouting. "I'm done listening to the creaking of your old bones and your endless sanctimonious lectures. Scott, let go." I clawed at his wrist, but my hands, the hands that had carried beams and driven 10,000 nails, felt suddenly frail. The pain in my hip from the granite corner was a throbbing, nauseating heat. "Are you out of your mind? It's 10 degrees out there. There's a blizzard. Then you should have kept your mouth shut and opened your wallet." Scott screamed, his voice breaking into a jagged, high-pitched wail. He dragged me toward the mudroom. Lisa followed, her arms crossed, watching with a detached, clinical interest, as if she were witnessing a demolition crew clearing a lot. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was a secondary shove, just as cold and just as calculated. Scott kicked the back door open. The impact was physical. A wall of white, screaming ice surged into the warm kitchen, instantly turning the air into a vortex of needles. The snow swirled onto the polished floorboards, melting and dying in seconds. I tried to plant my feet, to find a load-bearing stance. But Scott was fueled by a manic, desperate strength. He lunged forward, throwing his entire weight into me. I flew backward. My slippers found no grip on the threshold. For a split second, I was weightless, suspended in the roar of the gale, and then gravity claimed me. I landed hard on the frozen cedar decking of the porch. The appet drove the remaining air from my lungs in a ragged gasp. The wood, which I had stained with protective oil only last autumn, was now a sheet of black ice. I slid toward the steps, my hands searching for the railing, but the cold was already beginning to numb my skin. I rolled onto my side, gasping for air that felt like broken glass in my throat. The snow instantly began to accumulate on my eyelashes, blurring my vision. I looked up, blinking through the whiteout, and saw Scott standing in the doorway. He was framed by the golden amber warmth of the kitchen. My kitchen. Behind him, the steam from the kettle was still rising. It looked like a postcard of a home, a sanctuary of safety and light. Scott's face was twisted in a grimace of triumph and terror. "Go to a nursing home," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the freight train roar of the wind. "Go find a place where they'll listen to your stories. I hope you freeze. You old bastard. I hope you finally get as cold as you've always been." Slam. The sound was final. It was the sound of a coffin lid being hammered shut. Then came the metallic, rhythmic click of the deadbolt. My deadbolt, a grade 1 high-security schlag I had installed myself, specifically because I wanted the strongest lock on the market. I lay on the ice, staring at the closed door. The grain of the wood, tight-grained mahogany I'd hand-selected for its durability, was the last thing I saw before the porch light flickered and died. My son just killed me, I thought. It wasn't a dramatic realization. It was a cold, structural fact. He hadn't used a knife or a gun. He had simply used the environment. I forced myself up to my hands and knees. The wind chill was a physical weight, pushing against my chest, trying to flatten me against the decking. I was wearing thin cotton pajama pants, a t-shirt, and a zip-up fleece. My feet were protected by nothing but foam-soled slippers that were already soaking through. I was dressed for a night of television and a warm bed, not for the Arctic. I lunged for the door handle. I gripped the brass and turned. It was a solid, immovable lump of metal. I pounded on the glass of the door with my fist. the vibration rattling up my arm and into my teeth. "Scott! Scott, open this door!" I croaked. The wind whipped the words away before they could even hit the glass. "This isn't a joke. You're going to kill me." Through the triple-paned, high-efficiency glass I had touted for its incredible insulation, I saw him. He wasn't calling an ambulance. He wasn't crying. He was walking calmly to the refrigerator. He opened the door, the light spilling across his face. He reached in and pulled out a beer. My beer, a craft lager I kept for special occasions. He popped the top, the foam spilling over his hand, and took a long, slow drink with his back to me. Lisa walked into the frame. She put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that was almost tender, and whispered something in his ear. Scott turned to her, and then he did the one thing I couldn't survive. He laughed. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he reached for the wall switch. Click! The porch was plunged into a total, suffocating darkness. The only light now came from the moonlight, reflecting off the swirling chaos of the snow. I was no longer a father. I was a ghost watching the living through a window. Panic is a cold thing. It doesn't burn. It freezes the gears of the mind. I felt it starting in the pit of my stomach, spreading through my limbs faster than the frost. I had spent 40 years on winter job sites. I knew the math of the cold. I started running the calculations in my head because it was the only way to keep the terror at bay. Ambient temperature 10 degrees. Wind chill approximately -10. Clothing insulation value, CLO, effectively 0 for these conditions. Physical state: elevated heart rate, bruised hip, 68 years of wear and tear. I had 20 minutes of manual dexterity left before my fingers became useless clubs. I had perhaps an hour before my core temperature dropped enough to induce the umbles, the stumbles, mumbles, and fumbles of stage 1 hypothermia. After that, the sleep would come. I ran to the kitchen window, my bare feet. I'd lost one slipper in the snow already. Burning as they touched the frozen wood, I tried to jam my fingers under the sash. It was useless. I had shimmed these windows myself to a tolerance of less than 1/16 of an inch. I had used high-security latches that locked automatically. I had built a fortress to keep the world out, and now the fortress was working perfectly to keep me in the cold. "Solve the problem, Frank," I whispered to myself, my voice already sounding like someone else's. "You're a builder. Every problem has a structural solution." I moved toward the garage side door, limping on my injured hip. The digital keypad glowed with a faint mocking blue. My fingers were shaking so violently I had to use my left hand to steady my right. I punched in the code, 195. The year my father had started Miller & Sons. Beep, beep, beep. A red light flashed. I stared at it, uncomprehending. I tried again, slower this time. 952. Red light. He had changed it. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment shove. Scott had been eroding my foundations for weeks. He had been cutting the cables one by one while I was busy worrying about his debt. A memory flashed in my mind, vivid and sharp. 2 weeks ago, Sarah at the bank had called. She had seemed hesitant, worried. "Frank, did you authorize a change to your online security questions?" I had brushed it off as a glitch in their new system. It wasn't a glitch. It was a siege. The cold was biting deeper now, past the skin and into the bone. My ears were stinging with a sharp, rhythmic throb. My toes were no longer cold. They were simply gone. The sensation had vanished, replaced by a dull, leaden weight. I ran toward the shed at the back of the property, 30 feet away through drifts that were already knee-high. I knew I had a spare key there, hidden under a fake plastic rock near the potting bench. I fell twice, my face burying in the drifts, the snow finding its way down the collar of my fleece. I reached the spot and began digging frantically, my fingers clawing at the ice like a dog. I found the rock. I flipped it over, empty. I let out a yell of pure, unadulterated frustration, but the wind caught it and shattered it against the trees. He had taken the key. He had thought of everything. He had mapped out the demolition of my life with the precision of a professional. I huddled against the leeward side of the shed, my body shaking with such violence that my teeth clicked together. "Think, Frank. Think." I looked at the garden. Near the edge of the patio there was a loose paving stone, a blue slate piece I had never properly set. I could pry it up. I could smash the dining room window. I could trigger the alarm. I grabbed a garden trowel that had been forgotten in a planter. The frozen metal handle burned my palm like dry ice, the skin sticking to the steel. I wedged it under the stone and heaved with everything I had left. The stone popped loose from the frozen earth with a sickening, wet crack. I carried it back toward the house, my breath coming in ragged, white plumes. I stood in front of the large dining room window. I could see the china cabinet inside, the one I'd built for my wife, Martha, 30 years ago. I raised the stone, then I stopped. If I broke that window, the ADT alarm would scream. The police would be here in 10 minutes, and what would they find? They would find an old man in his pajamas, barefoot and wild-eyed, holding a rock, screaming about his son, and I remembered the conversation from Thanksgiving. Scott leaning in toward his cousin, speaking in that soft, concerned tone. Dad's been getting so confused lately, leaving the stove on, forgetting the codes to the garage. It's breaking my heart, but I think he's slipping. It had been the soft opening for the lie. If I broke that window, I wasn't saving myself. I was handing him the final piece of evidence he needed. He would tell the officers I had snapped. He would have me committed for my own protection. He would get the power of attorney. He'd get the house, the money, the land, and the land was what this was really about. I lowered the stone. The weight of it felt like the weight of my own tombstone. I couldn't give him the satisfaction. I would rather die in the snow with my dignity intact than live in a padded room while he sold my life's work to a developer. But I couldn't stay here. My hands were turning a waxy, translucent white. The pain in my feet had transitioned from acid to a terrifying, total lack of sensation. I looked through the trees, past the fence. Next door lived Helen, a widow, sharp-tongued, private, and tough as a winter-killed oak. Her house was 50 yards away. In a summer afternoon, it was a 30-second walk. In a blizzard, in pajamas, it was a journey across a frozen wasteland. Go, I whispered to myself, my lips feeling like thick, useless rubber. I stepped off the cleared patio and into the drift. The first step into the unplowed snow was a revelation of agony. The crust of the ice broke under my weight, and my bare feet, I had abandoned the second slipper as a useless weight, sank 12 inches deep into a powdery sub-zero abyss. It felt like stepping into liquid nitrogen. The cold didn't just touch my skin. It bypassed the nerves and went straight for the bone, vibrating through my skeleton like a tuning fork. I focused on the fence. It was a low, chain-link divider I'd installed 30 years ago to keep a young Scot from wandering into Helen's flower beds. Now it was the finish line of a marathon I wasn't prepared to run. Keep the load balanced, Frank, I hissed through grit teeth. My jaw was beginning to lock, the muscles tightening in an involuntary spasm. Don't let the center of gravity shift. I trudged forward. Every step was a tactical maneuver. Lift the knee, drive the foot down, endure the searing bite of the frost. Repeat. The wind roared through the gap between our houses, a natural wind tunnel that tried to knock me flat. I fell once, my hip screaming as it hit a buried rock. I stayed down for a moment, my face pressed into the snow. It was peaceful down there. The wind was quieter. The snow felt soft. It felt like a heavy, white blanket. I could just close my eyes. I could let the cold finish what Scott had started. It would be so easy to stop fighting the physics of the storm. If you sleep, he wins, a voice whispered in my mind. It sounded like Martha, my Martha. She had been the mortar that held my bricks together. And even though she'd been gone for 5 years, her voice still had the authority of a foreman. Frank Miller, you didn't spend 40 years building things that last just to let a parasite tear you down. I forced my hands into the snow and pushed. My fingers didn't feel like fingers anymore. They felt like frozen sausages, stiff and unresponsive. I reached the fence and grabbed the top rail. The cold metal seared my palms instantly. It was a thermal bridge in the worst sense. Conductive heat loss so rapid it felt like a branding iron. I didn't care. I used the rail to haul myself over. My pajama pants snagged on a wire tie, the thin cotton ripping with a sharp scritch that was lost in the wind. I tumbled over the other with her, landing in Helen's yard in a heap of torn fabric and bruised pride. I crawled the last 20 feet, I was no longer a man. I was a creature of pure survival instinct, dragging a broken frame through the dirt. I reached her back door and hammered on the wood with a fist that felt like a block of ice. "Helen," I croaked. My throat was so constricted by the cold it sounded like a death rattle. "Helen, please." The lights inside flickered. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass of the door. Then, the sound of 3 different locks turning. Helen was a woman who understood security as well as I did. The door swung open, and the heat hit me. It wasn't a gentle warmth. It was a violent, suffocating wall of air. To a man whose core temperature was dipping toward the danger zone. 70 degrees felt like an oven. Helen stood there, silhouetted against the light of her kitchen. She was wearing a thick, charcoal wool cardigan and holding a hardcover book. She looked down at the shivering, barefoot, half-naked wreck on her doorstep, and for the first time in the 20 years I'd known her, her sharp eyes went wide with genuine shock. "Frank? Scott?" I managed to gasp. "Locked out. He shoved me." She didn't ask for a detailed explanation. She didn't hesitate. Helen was the daughter of a Great Depression survivor. She knew that in a crisis, you move first and talk later. She reached down, grabbed the collar of my fleece, and hauled me inside with a strength that belied her 70 years. She slammed the door and the roar of the world vanished. Then came the screaming barfies. That's what we called it on the high steel jobs, the moment the blood starts rushing back into frozen extremities. As my vessels dilated, the sensation wasn't a pleasant warmth. It felt like millions of red-hot needles were being driven under my skin, into the nail beds, and up through the marrow of my shins. I collapsed onto her kitchen rug, curling into a ball, a low guttural groan escaping my throat. "Don't you dare die on my Persian rug, Frank Miller," Helen snapped, though her hands were gentle as she draped a heavy wool blanket over my shoulders. I just had it cleaned. She was a whirlwind of pragmatic motion. She didn't use hot water. She knew that would damage the tissue. She brought a basin of tepid water and placed my feet into it. The contact made me cry out, a sharp, undignified sound that echoed off her pristine cabinets. "Scream all you want," Helen said, her voice grim. "Pain means the nerves are still firing. It's the silence you have to worry about." She handed me a mug of coffee. It was black, bitter, and laced with a generous pour of brandy. I took a sip, the liquid burning its way down my throat, slowly chasing the core chill from my chest. As the shivering began to subside from a violent tremor to a rhythmic shudder, I looked at her. "He tried to kill me, Helen. He didn't just lock the door. He changed the codes. He took the spare key from the shed. He turned out the lights and watched me freeze." Helen sat in the chair opposite me, her face a mask of cold fury. She looked toward the window that faced my house. "I saw," she said softly. My heart skipped a beat. "You saw?" I was in the sunroom, finishing my chapter. I saw the headlights of his car earlier, then I saw the shadows on the kitchen blinds. "I saw him push you. I saw him stand in that doorway like a king, while you were on the ice. I was already putting on my boots to come get you when I heard your fist hit my door." "He wants the house," I said, the shame finally catching up to the cold. "He thinks I'm a structural defect in his balance sheet. He's going to tell the world I'm senile." "Helen, he's already started the lie." "He's a fool," Helen said, her voice as sharp as a chisel. "He thinks because he can move numbers on a screen, he understands power. He doesn't understand the foundations of this town." She stood up and walked to the wall-mounted phone in her kitchen, an old-fashioned landline. "Frank, you know who Scott works for, don't you?" "That big firm downtown." "Miller Construction," I said. "No relation to me. George Miller runs it. He's a hard-nosed bastard. Scott treats him like a god." Helen picked up the receiver and began to dial a number from memory. A thin, dangerous smile touched her lips. "George is coming for breakfast tomorrow," she said. I blinked, the brandy warmth making my head swim. "What? Why?" "George is my younger brother, Frank. Our maiden name is Miller. I kept my husband's name, Henderson, but George hasn't missed a post-storm breakfast with me in 15 years. He checks on his Eeg sister to make sure the roof hasn't caved in." The coincidence felt like a structural reinforcement. A steel beam suddenly swinging into place to support a collapsing ceiling. "And George," Helen added, her eyes sparkling with a cold blue light, "has a very low tolerance for 2 things. Thieves and cowards who don't respect the men who built the world they're standing on. She poured me more coffee, her hand steady. You stay here tonight, Frank. You're safe. But tomorrow morning we aren't just going to fix your locks. We're going to perform a total demolition. I lay in her guest bed that night, but sleep was a distant country. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the shove. I heard the click of the deadbolt. The betrayal was a crack in my foundation that no amount of warmth could ever truly fill. I thought about the legalities. I thought about the paperwork Scott had been pressuring me to sign. I realized with a start he wouldn't just be waiting for me to freeze. He would be cleaning house. I need the ledger, I whispered to the empty room. The master ledger. The black book in the study. It contained every loan, every date, and more importantly, the original, unshredded promissory note Scott had signed for that first $40,000. At 5:00 a.m., the wind finally died down to a low, mournful whistle. The world outside was a silent, blue-tinted landscape of deep drifts. I got up, my hips stiff, and my feet tender, and dressed in a set of work clothes. Helen had left out her late husband's old flannel shirt and heavy canvas pants. They smelled of cedar and thyme. "Where are you going?" Helen asked, meeting me at the bottom of the stairs. "I'm going back," I said. "I need evidence, and I know a way in that Scott doesn't." The world at 5:30 a.m. was a study in bruised purples and cold, metallic blues. The storm had left behind a cathedral of silence, broken only by the rhythmic crunch hiss of my boots. Harry's old boots, breaking through the frozen crust of the snow. My hip was a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with my heartbeat, a constant reminder of the granite corner that had nearly been my headstone. I didn't take the path back through the yard. I moved like a thief along the tree line, using the shadows of the hemlocks to mask my approach. I felt like a stranger trespassing on my own life. I looked at the house, the silhouette of the gables, the sturdy chimney, the windows I had framed with such pride. It looked different now. It looked like a trap. A house is a living thing, Frank. My father used to say, it breathes, it settles, and it always has a secret. I reached the back door. The wood was cold, the mahogany grain I had loved, now feeling like the skin of a shark. I didn't reach for the handle first. I looked at the striker plate. 2 years ago, after a particularly humid summer, the house had settled 1/8 of an inch to the west. It was a minor shift, but enough to make the deadbolt rub against the plate. I had intended to file it down, but I discovered a quirk. If you lifted the handle upward while jiggling it toward the hinge, the bolt would bypass the catch. It was a flaw I'd left unfixed, a builder's hidden door. I placed my hands on the handle. My fingers, still tender from the frost, screamed at the contact with the cold brass. I took a breath, feeling the sub-zero air fill my lungs, and lifted, jiggle, lift, click. The sound was no louder than a snapping twig, but in the morning silence it felt like a thunderclap. The door swung open on its well-oiled hinges. I stepped inside, and the heat of the kitchen hit me like a physical blow. The house didn't smell like mine anymore. The scent of pine and sawdust had been choked out by the smell of stale beer and a heavy, cloying perfume that Lisa favored, something that smelled like artificial lilies and desperation. I moved silently, my boots muffled by the rug. My builder's eyes immediately went to the kitchen table. It was empty. The black notebook was gone. The gold pen was gone. I felt a surge of cold dread. If it had destroyed the records, the math of my life was erased. I checked the trash can next to the island. I stepped on the pedal, the hinge squeaking, a sound I'd never noticed before, and looked inside. There, resting on top of a heap of coffee grounds and an empty champagne bottle, were the shredded white remains of the promissory note. He had taken the original loan agreement, the one with his shaky signature from last April, and run it through the cross-cut shredder. "Destroy the evidence of the debt," I whispered. "Step 1 of the demolition." But Scott was a project manager, not a craftsman. He didn't know about the secondary supports. I crept toward my study at the end of the hall. Every floorboard I had laid myself now felt like a landmine. I knew exactly which ones groaned. The joist near the linen closet, the board by the thermostat. I navigated the hall like a ghost, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside the study, the air was still. I went to the bookshelf, a massive unit built of solid walnut. I reached for the third shelf, the volumes on structural load-bearing and New England architecture. I pressed a small recessed nut in the wood. A hollow false bottom popped open. I pulled it out, the master ledger. It was an identical black notebook, but this one was the as-built version. Every penny I had ever lent him, every serial number of the tools he'd borrowed and never returned, and a carbon copy of the promissory note he'd thought he destroyed. I tucked it into the front of my shirt, the cold cover chilling my skin. I was about to leave when I saw a manila file folder sitting on the center of my desk. It was marked in Scott's neat architectural lettering, "Urgent, Friday." I opened it, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The first page was a medical evaluation on official-looking letterhead. Patient: Frank Miller. Diagnosis: Stage 4 neurodegenerative dementia with aggressive onset. Recommendation: immediate involuntary institutionalization for the safety of the patient and the public. Signed, Dr. Iris Thorne. I had never met a Dr. Thorne in my life. I stared at the signature, the ink looking fresh and mocking. I flipped the page. Beneath the medical report was a printout of an email chain. From Marcus Vance. Vance Developers, to Scott Miller. Subject: Phase 1, the Miller lot. Scott, the financing is locked, but I need that old man out of the way by Friday. My demolition crew is roused for Monday morning. The city council has already greenlit the zoning change for the condos. That land is worth double once the house is flattened. Don't get sentimental on me now. I felt the blood drain from my head. It wasn't just my money. It wasn't just a lockout. Scott wasn't trying to take over my life. He was trying to erase it. He was selling my home, the house I had built with my own sweat. The house where Martha had died. The house that was the only thing I had left of my history to be torn down and replaced by cheap, profit-driven boxes. My son was the wrecking ball. Creak, the sound came from directly above my head. The master bedroom. Then the heavy, muffled sound of a toilet flushing. The pipes in the wall hissed. A sound I had always found comforting, but now it sounded like a warning. He was awake. I froze, my hands still clutching the file. I heard footsteps. They weren't the light, tentative steps of a guest. They were heavy, proprietary, the steps of a man who already owned the floor he was walking on. I shoved the file and the master ledger into the waistband of my pants, pulling the heavy flannel shirt over them. I moved toward the study door, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I heard him on the stairs. Thump, thump. He was humming. A light, upbeat tune. He was happy. He was waking up to the first day of his new life. The day he would finally clear the lot. I slipped out of the study and pressed myself against the wall in the shadows of the mudroom. I saw his shadow past the kitchen doorway. A tall, confident silhouette. He reached for the coffee maker. I didn't wait to see more. I slipped out the back door, closing it with the agonizing slowness of a surgeon. I engaged the handle, heard the click, and then I ran. I didn't care about the noise now. I ran through the snow, my heart screaming, the weight of the betrayal heavier than the ledger against my chest. I reached Helen's back porch, just as the first orange sliver of the sun broke over the horizon, turning the snow into a field of fire. I burst into her kitchen, gasping for air, the file clutched in my shaking hands. Helen was standing at the stove, a cast-iron skillet in her hand. She looked at my face, then at the folder. "Found it," she said. "It wasn't a question. He's selling it, Helen," I choked out, the words catching in my throat. "He's selling the house to Marcus Vance. They're tearing it down on Monday. He has a fake doctor. They're going to say I've lost my mind." Helen set the skillet down. She walked over to me and took the file. She read through the diagnosis, her face hardening into something like granite. "Dr. Iris Thorne," she whispered. "I know that name. George mentioned it. He's a medical consultant for developers. He finds whatever illness is necessary to clear a title." She looked out the window at the black truck pulling into her driveway. "George is here," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And I think it's time we showed my brother exactly what kind of liquidity your son has been searching for." The morning light was deceptive. It looked warm, a pale honey gold spilling across the snow-choked valley, but the air remained a razor. Inside Helen's kitchen, the atmosphere was even colder. George Miller sat at the head of the table. He was a man who looked like he had been hewn from a single block of hickory thick-necked, with hands that had spent 40 years shaking hands with steel and concrete. He wore a canvas work coat that smelled of diesel and cold wind. He didn't speak as he read through the file I had retrieved from the study. He didn't have to. The way his jaw muscle pulsed like a trapped heart told the story. "Thorne," George growled, his voice a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate the coffee in my mug. "He's a scavenger, a medical mercenary. He's helped Vance relocate 3 homeowners in the downtown district last year. All of them ended up in state-run wards while their properties were leveled for luxury lofts." "He's my son, George," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I taught him the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. I taught him that a man's word is the only thing that doesn't rot. Where did I miss the crack in his character? George looked at me, his eyes softening just a fraction. "Some timber has a hidden rot, Frank. It looks solid on the outside until the first real load hits it. This isn't on the builder. This is on the wood." The door opened, admitting a final gust of winter, and a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes behind rectangular glasses. Sarah Jenkins, George's niece and the chief compliance officer at the regional bank. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional steel as she set a thick accordion folder on the table. "I've been running the audit since George called me at dawn," Sarah said, her voice crisp and devoid of sentiment. "Frank, I'm sorry. It's worse than a simple loan. Scott has been funneling money from his firm's operational account into a shell company called Davis Consulting for 8 months. "Davis," I whispered. "That was Lisa's maiden name." "Exactly," Sarah said, flipping through the logs. 50,000 in the last 6 months alone. He was invoicing for site surveys that never happened, and environmental assessments for projects that don't exist. He wasn't just investing your 40,000, Frank. He was using it to cover the tracks of his embezzlement. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and Peter was his own father. George stood up. His chair didn't scrape the floor. It groaned under the sudden shift of his massive weight. He buttoned his coat with slow, deliberate movements. "I've seen enough," George said. "I'm going over there. I'm going to fire him. Then I'm going to break his nose, and then I'm going to watch the police take what's left of him." "No," I said, standing up. My hip flared in protest, but I ignored it. "I'm going with you," George narrowed his eyes. "Frank, you don't need to see this. He's dangerous. He's desperate." "He tried to kill me, George," I said, my voice finally finding its resonance. "I need to see the moment the mask falls off. I need to look him in the eye when he realizes that the dinosaur isn't extinct yet. I'm going into my house." We crossed the lawn like a small, grim army. Me, Helen, George, and Sarah. Our footprints in the fresh snow looked like a path toward a reckoning. I didn't go to the back door this time. I walked straight to the front, the grand entrance I had built to welcome friends. I used the spare key Helen had kept for 10 years. The lock turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. The house was warm, sickeningly warm. It smelled of expensive coffee and wood smoke. We walked into the living room, and the scene I found there was a tableau of betrayal. Scott and Lisa were sitting on the leather sofa, looking like the picture of a grieving, stressed-out couple. Between them sat Marcus Vance, a man who looked like a polished stone, wearing a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. "We can list it as a total teardown," Vance was saying, his voice a smooth, oily baritone. "We'll have the demolition crew here Monday. If we file the missing persons report today, citing the dementia diagnosis, we can get emergency judicial access to the deed by Wednesday. It's a clean break, Scott." "What about the neighbors?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with a fake trembling concern. "People like Helen? They'll ask questions." "Let them ask," Scott said, and the coldness in his voice made my blood run cold. "They're just old relics like him. They'll be gone in a few years anyway. Once the old man's body turns up in a drift somewhere this spring, we'll play the tragic son who tried to save his wandering father. We'll be the victims." "Is that the plan, Scott?" I asked. The voice that came out of me didn't sound like mine. It sounded like the house itself speaking. Scott jumped so violently, he upended his coffee mug, the dark liquid soaking into the white wool rug I had bought for Martha's 50th birthday. Lisa let out a sharp, jagged scream. "Dad?" Scott whispered. He stared at me as if I were a ghost. He looked at my face, then down at my feet, now in Harry's sturdy boots, and then back at my eyes. For a split second, I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised, terrified of getting caught. But it was replaced instantly by a snarling, predatory aggression. "Where the hell were you?" he shouted, standing up, his face turning that ugly, patchy red again. "You senile old bat. You wandered off in the middle of a storm. We'd been worried sick. We were just talking to Marcus here about hiring a private search team." He looked at Vance, signaling for him to join the line. "See, Marcus, this is what I was telling you. He wanders. He doesn't know where he is. He's a danger to himself." "Liar," I said, stepping into the light of the living room. "You shoved me, Scott. You locked the door. You watched me through the glass while you drank a beer and laughed. You didn't wait for me to wander. You tried to ensure I never came back." "You're crazy," Scott shrieked. He was vibrating with a manic energy now. "You're imagining things. It's the dementia. I have the doctor's note right here." He reached for the folder on the coffee table. "You mean this note?" I held up the file I'd taken from his desk. "The one signed by a man George tells me is a medical mercenary for hire." Scott's eyes darted toward the hallway, looking for an exit. And that's when he saw him. George Miller stepped out from behind me, his massive frame filling the doorway. The color didn't just leave Scott's face, it seemed to evaporate. He went a sickly, translucent gray. Mr. Miller?" Scott stammered. "Sir? What are you?" "It's a family matter, sir. My father is very ill. We're just managing the transition." "The only thing being managed today, Scott, is your termination," George said, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "I came to check on my sister Helen. She told me a very interesting story about a neighbor who was left to die in a snowdrift." "Your sister?" Scott looked at Helen, who stood beside George with her arms crossed, her expression one of absolute, icy disdain. "Small world, isn't it?" Helen said. "And I think you know my niece, Sarah," George added. Sarah stepped forward, holding the bank records like a weapon. "Hi, Scott. I think we need to have a very long talk about Davis Consulting, and about the $50,000 you've been siphoning from the firm's payroll tax account." Lisa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She tried to slide her phone into her pocket, but Sarah's gaze pinned her in place. Scott didn't fight. He didn't argue. He fell. His knees hit the floor with a dull thud. The corporate titan, the deal maker, the brain worker, he evaporated in an instant. He was just a small, hollow man in an expensive suit, weeping on a rug he didn't own. "Mr. Miller, please," he sobbed, reaching out toward George's boots. "It was a mistake. I was going to pay it back. I was under so much pressure, the market. Vance promised me a payout. I did it for my dad. I needed the money for his medical bills. He has cancer. He's dying. I walked up to my son. I looked down at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no grief, just a cold, clinical observation of a structural failure. "I don't have cancer, Scott," I said softly. The room went silent, but you were right about one thing. There is a cancer in this house. There's a rot that's been eating at the foundations while I was busy painting the wall. I leaned down, my face inches from his, and I'm cutting it out today. The sirens arrived 10 minutes later. The sirens arrived 10 minutes later. The red and blue lights pulsed against the white snow outside, a rhythmic reminder that the law had finally arrived at the scene of the crime. Officer Brady, a boy who had played football with Scott, a boy I had coached in Little League, walked in with his head low. He looked at me, then at the bruises on my arms, then at Scott, who was being led out in handcuffs. "Scott," O'Brien, Brady whispered, his voice full of a young man's disillusionment. "Elder abuse? Fraud? What happened to you, man?" Scott didn't answer. He was ashamed. Lisa was still screaming, blaming Marcus Vance, blaming me, blaming the house, her voice a shrill, fading siren as they were loaded into the cruisers. Marcus Vance said nothing. He simply waited for his lawyer, his eyes already calculating his next move. George stayed behind. He called a locksmith who arrived within 30 minutes to change every cylinder in the house. He didn't ask for payment. "You okay, Frank?" George asked, clapping a hand on my shoulder as the last police car disappeared down the drive. "No," I said, looking at the empty kitchen. "I'm not." "He was a bad seed, Frank," George said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "He was my seed, George," I replied. I'm the one who planted him. I'm the one who didn't notice the rot until the roof fell in. George left. Sarah left. The house was mine again. I walked through the room. The silence was different now. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a well-built home. It was the silence of a tomb. I saw the scuff mark from Scott's chair. I saw the coffee stain on the rug. I went to the kitchen and picked up the master ledger. I found the page for Scott. I saw the numbers, the 40,000, the investments, the years of support. I picked up a red pen. I didn't just cross it out. I drew a thick, heavy line through his entire name. Bad debt, written off. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. I saw the path I had taken in the dark. I saw the place where I had fallen. My footprints were still there, frozen in the snow, a record of a man who had been pushed to the edge and refused to fall. I realized then that a house isn't just wood and stone. A house is a story, and some chapters are so ugly they have to be burned so the rest of the book can survive. I looked at the photos on the mantel. Scott as a boy, Scott at graduation. I didn't throw them away. I just turned them face down. I went to the sink and washed the coffee cup Scott had used. I dried it. I put it away. Then I put on my coat. I walked out the back door. I walked to the fence. I didn't climb it this time. I walked through the gate I had built so the neighbors could visit. I knocked on Helen's door. She opened it immediately. She didn't say a word. She just stepped back and held the door open. "Is the pot roast ready?" I asked. "It is," she said. "And Frank?" "Yeah? You're not a relic. You're a landmark. And landmarks don't get torn down easily." I stepped inside, and for the first time in a long, cold year, the click of the lock behind me didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a new foundation. Every sturdy home is built one brick, one beam, and one honest moment at a time. If Frank's journey resonated with you, if you felt the bite of the cold and the relief of the thaw, please take a moment to like this story and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help us lay the foundation for more narratives that look the hard truths in the eye and refuse to blink. Let's keep building something real together.